Hey friends, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As you might have realized if you're keeping up to date with the videos, there wasn't a video on Sunday. I actually filmed it that Sunday night, trying to edit and upload it on Sunday, but I just did not like the quality. It looked really bad and I just didn't feel comfortable putting it on the channel. So hopefully you guys can forgive me for that. I'm gonna do this video, redo it, and hopefully the quality is a lot better. The lighting was just really bad. Right now I'm using the natural lighting and it seems to be doing okay on my camera, so we're just gonna move on. Alright, so today's video is gonna be part 2 of the Bible breakdown for the book of Genesis. I'm very excited to be doing this because I feel like the book of Genesis really establishes everything else in the Bible, and it really gives us a way to look back and connect a few dots. In part 1, we talked about the 4 main events that happened, which the first one was creation, the second one was the fall of man, the third one was the flood, and the fourth one was the confusion of tongues. And hopefully you guys learned something from that. It's basically just setting up everything, like why, how the earth was formed, right? What the original sin was, how that affected us now, talking about how language was created, which to me, as a language freak, was super interesting, and I encourage you guys to look more into that. Now, part 2 is going to be a little different because instead of talking about 4 main events, we're talking about 4 great men of the Bible, and it's going to be basically talking about the creation of the Hebrew nation, or of Israel. So let's just go ahead and begin with that. So the first man that we're going to talk about is Abraham. Now the first great man that we can talk about is Abraham. Now I'm going to read a quick verse. If you see me looking this way, it's because I have a screen there. And it's in Genesis 12, 1-3. It says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will shew thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all famines of the earth be blessed." And that's Genesis 12, 1-3. And the reason that I chose to mention this verse, it's going to be the only verse that I physically or verbally say out loud, is because it really sets up the rest of the story of Genesis and the descendancy of Abraham, and how because of him we have the line that basically produced our Lord and Savior, Jesus. The book of Genesis, Abraham is mentioned in verses 12-24. He is the son of Terah, was born in Ur, and married at that time Sarai, but later her name is changed to Sarah, who was actually a woman that was barren. And what made Abraham different from everyone else is that he chose to worship God. He didn't choose to worship idols. He rejected that part, and he became what is known as the man of faith, and went forth and actually had a relationship with God. We already read that verse where God tells him to leave his house, and God, because he chose to worship just God exclusively, he gave him that promise of leave the house, leave your father's house, go unto the land of Canaan, and I will bless you and your descendancy and your line. And there's a specific verse that talks about it being like the amount of stars in the sky, and I'll link any verse that I mentioned, so not link, right, type any verse that I mentioned down here so you guys can read it. After traveling a lot with Lot, we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sarah actually becomes pregnant at the age of 100. That sounds crazy, right? But she actually becomes pregnant with their son, Isaac. We actually did a whole video about Isaac and how he's significant in the Bible. I will link that video about Isaac somewhere here. You guys can refer to that video. It really just talks about the parallels between Isaac and Jesus, how Isaac kind of foreshadowed the coming of Christ, and the impact that he would have in our lives, and how he would sacrifice himself for our salvation. Isaac, although significant, there isn't much about his youth. The Bible doesn't really talk about too much about his youth. The sacrifice, when he was sacrificed, the Bible mentions that he was probably it refers to him maybe being a young adult, so we're assuming between his 20s and 30s, somewhere in that range, still a young adult. And so there's not much about his youth, so we can just go ahead and I guess skip forward. He marries Rebecca, and Rebecca gives birth to twin sons. Their name are Esau and Jacob. So he had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was known for being brawny and just muscular and more, I guess you could say, physically strong, while Jacob was known for his quick wit and for his intelligence, which was something that Rebecca really liked from him. Now, the favoritism between Esau and Jacob are really what caused a lot of hardships and a lot of trials. Jacob ends up betraying his brother, which we're going to talk about later in the video because it kind of connects with his own story because he's pretty significant. So we're just going to move forward from Isaac. Now, Jacob was born being favored by Rebekah. In the Bible, he's known for grasping the heel of Esau. So we know Esau was the oldest, and Jacob was actually born just grabbing onto his heel, which was a sign of deception. His name literally means like the deceiver. And he was the big, like, as we mentioned previously, like the really big thing that he did was that he stole his brother's birthright. And this whole thing was basically a plan between him and his mother Rebekah, and how they tricked Isaac into giving the blessing to the wrong son. Now, Jacob's betrayal is what caused him to flee to Haran with his uncle Laban. And while he was there, he actually fell in love with Rachel. And Rachel is actually his cousin, which I know sounds funky to us, but back then that was like a very normal thing. So let's just leave it at that. Let's not dig in too much into that and just move forward. God also revealed himself to Jacob and gave him basically the same promise that he gave his father, his grandfather, that his family, his offering would be the offspring, would be the blessing of the earth. Now, during this time, like we mentioned, Jacob actually fell in love with Rachel. And to win Rachel, I guess you could say, or to be able to marry her, Laban actually said that he had to work for 7 years. So Jacob went ahead, did his time, worked for those 7 years, worked very hard. And when he goes to marry Rachel, he is deceived into marrying Leah. And he goes back to Laban, says that wasn't the deal. But I guess Laban says that he couldn't just marry his youngest daughter before he married his oldest daughter. So he gave Jacob another opportunity to marry Rachel, and that was to work for another 7 years. So Jacob, again, works for another 7 years, so a total of 14 years for the 2 wives that he had. And during this whole time, like, there's an obvious favoritism between Leah and Rachel. He obviously loves Rachel more because that was the girl that he was going for first, versus Leah. And that in itself just causes a lot of struggles and a lot of hardships as well. Now, what's interesting about this is that through life we go through a lot of hardships. We go through a lot of struggles, just like Jacob did in this story. But there's a reason for it. And what I thought was interesting was as we read that story of Jacob and Rachel, we learn that he struggled very much for her hand to be able to marry her, and he actually during that time was building a lot of wealth. So yeah, like, he went through a hardship trying to marry his the wife that he wanted, essentially, but he also amassed a certain amount of wealth, which was what benefited him. So yeah, he was going through a lot. He didn't get the outcome he wanted, but hard work pays off, and God still blessed him for the things that he did. Now later on, he ends up making up with his brother Esau, and they all moved to Canaan. And I guess that's when we can kind of transition into the next great man of the Bible. Total, Jacob had 12 sons between with Leah and Rachel, and they had 1 daughter, which was named Dinah, and we actually talked about her in a Pursuing Jesus video. So I will link that video in the description box, and again, maybe a link somewhere here that you guys can go ahead and learn more about her. Her story is very interesting, and I find that for young ladies, it's a very useful story, a very practical story to apply to our lives. Joseph is the last main character of the book of Genesis. He's mentioned between verses 37 and 50, and he is the favored son of Jacob. Again, with this favoritism, right? Like, Jacob was favored by Rebekah and so on and so forth. You think Jacob would have, like, learned from that and not caused the same division of favoritism, like, influence his family, but I guess it did. Many reasons why Joseph was favored. One, he was like the son of old age, so Rachel had him like far in her years and in Jacob's years, and he was also the son of Rachel, and Rachel, obviously we know that she was like the favored wife of Jacob. Another reason why we know that Jacob favored Joseph was because he actually gave him a tunic that was all these different colors, and it was something, I guess, that none of his other sons had, and he gave it only to Joseph. And another thing that Joseph is known for is for being the dreamer. So he actually had a lot of dreams. He was able to interpret them, and one of the dreams that he had was that he saw his siblings actually serving him. And that obviously caused some anger between the siblings, because 1, he's already favored, and 2, he's telling them like, hey, you're gonna serve me. And obviously that causes some problems. Like, I never knew, or I don't really understand why Joseph would tell them. I feel like that maybe was a lack of wisdom and maybe just some pride that he had, that he shared that story with them. And that's ultimately like what pushed his siblings to do what they did, which we're going to explain right now. Basically, Joseph's siblings faked his death, and they took his tunic, covered it in blood, made him disappear. They actually sold him into slavery in Egypt, and the person that bought him was Potiphar. Potiphar was basically like captain of the guard. He took care of like all of the the guards in Egypt, and that's what that was his realm. Potiphar did seem to favor Joseph, and he gave him a good position in his home. He basically took care of all the household duties, and that caught a lot of attention from Potiphar's wife. Now, Potiphar's wife actually tried to sleep with Joseph, and when Joseph refused, she accused him of rape, which is a whole story that we did. I will link it somewhere here. We have mentioned some of these stories just because they've been mentioned in the devotionals. So I will link it somewhere here just so we can go more in depth, more analytical on that. Now, after Joseph gets thrown in jail, he meets two people. He meets a baker and a butler. And the baker and the butler both have dreams, and Joseph tells them like, hey, I can interpret them. So he interprets those dreams. When he interprets the dreams, he realizes that the butler is going to be exonerated, so he's going to be freed from prison, he's going to be pardoned, and the baker is actually going to be put to death. And what Joseph tries to take out of this is that he tells the butler, like, when you get out of prison, just mention me, like, let them know that I'm still in here and that I helped you. And the butler ends up forgetting, and so Joseph is stuck in prison for another 2 years. The Pharaoh ends up having another 2 dreams, and they call upon Joseph to help interpret the dreams, and none of the Pharaoh's interpreters could do it. They couldn't figure out what the message was, but Joseph did. And Joseph predicted that there was going to be a famine all across the land, and that Egypt had to basically prepare themselves for the coming of the famine. And that ended up being true. The famine did overcome the land, and Egypt was prepared. And for this reason, a lot of people were going to Egypt asking for resources, which is where the next part of the story comes in, and that is when Joseph's siblings actually end up in Egypt asking for food. And during this time, Joseph doesn't reveal himself. He doesn't tell them that he's his brother that they betrayed. He listens to them, he tests them, he asks for their brother Benjamin, and he asks them all these questions, and at the end he ends up revealing himself as his brother. And after he reveals himself, he ends up moving his whole family into Egypt, and they live there, and Joseph ends up dying in Egypt. Later his bones are moved back to his home by Moses, as we learn in the book of Exodus, but we're not going to go that far. So Joseph does end up dying in Egypt, and that is the end of the book of Genesis. Wow! There is so much. That was like 50 verses, a lot of information, a lot of stories, a lot of knowledge, a lot of content. I really hope I made this go by smoothly. I hope you guys learned something. I hope that there was something that you guys thought was interesting that maybe you didn't know before. I hope you guys can understand, like, I don't go too in depth in the Bible. Like, I go in depth in the Bible breakdown, but I don't dive in too hard, just because a lot of the stories are actually mentioned in the devotional. So if it's a story that I mentioned in the devotional, we're probably just gonna mention it and keep moving forward. Link that video if you want to listen to it. Go ahead, rate, like, comment on the video, share it, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll probably see a post that shows that I've posted, so just go ahead and like that. Share this with your friends. If someone wants to learn more about the Bible, learn more about Jesus, just go ahead and refer them to this channel. Yeah, so that's gonna be it for today's video. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. And yeah, I will see you guys soon. Have a great and amazing week. Bye, guys. Now, Isaac did prefer one of those twins versus the other. So the oldest was Esau, and the next... Wow. Toby, no. They always bark when I film. Now, Joseph's siblings basically faked his death. They took his tunic. Tunic. No. Okay. So it's really hot, man. It's really hot.